He was just a broke veteran walking home after a night shift. She was just a quiet woman trying to do her job, and the German Shepherd was already wounded when he chose to stand in front of her. No cameras, no applause, just a moment where one man had to decide, walk away, or become the miracle God needed that day. Stay with this story until the end. And if you believe that God still works through ordinary people, a gray November wind rolled in from the harbor, damp and metallic, pressing low over the city like a held breath, carrying the smell of salt, rust, and cold concrete through the small park beside the docks. Mike Carter felt the ache in his lower back before he felt the cold. It was a familiar pain, the kind that never truly left once it arrived, settling deep into bone and muscle like an unwelcome tenant that refused to move out. At 47, Mike's body carried its own quiet map of history. Stiff knees from years on steel decks, scarred knuckles from welding torches and old fights, a shoulder that never quite healed after an explosion overseas. He stood tall despite it, just over 6 feet, broad through the chest but leaner than he used to be, his strength worn down into something dense and practical rather than imposing. His face was angular and weathered, with a square jaw dusted in permanent stubble, and lines etched deep around steel gray eyes that rarely stopped watching. Those eyes had once scanned desert roads and foreign doorways for threats. Now they traced dog walkers, joggers, and passing trucks with the same unconscious vigilance. Mike wore a faded work jacket over a flannel shirt, heavy boots scuffed from years of labor, and jeans that smelled faintly of oil and iron no matter how often they were washed. He looked like what he was, a working man, invisible to most, carrying more than he ever spoke about. At his side walked Rex. The German Shepherd was 3 years old, large even for the breed, with a thick black and tan coat that caught the light in sharp contrast. His ears stood erect, alert to everything, and his amber-brown eyes missed little. Rex moved with a controlled confidence, not frantic, not aggressive, but deeply aware. There was a faint stiffness in his right hind leg, the leftover result of an old injury from before Mike found him at a county shelter scheduled for euthanasia. Rex had scars too, thin white lines beneath his fur that spoke of neglect and fear, but his posture had changed since those days. He stayed close to Mike's left leg, not out of anxiety but loyalty, his presence a quiet reassurance that Mike hadn't realized he needed until the dog entered his life. Rex was not just a pet. He was routine, responsibility, and something steady to come home to when the nights grew too long. Mike had finished a double shift welding support beams at the shipyard and taken the long way home, cutting through the small park near the docks. It wasn't scenic, just cracked pathways, struggling grass, and a few tired trees. But it gave Rex room to walk, and Mike a few minutes of air before returning to his rented room above a laundromat. As they passed a bench near the path, Mike noticed a young woman hurrying toward the park exit, juggling a canvas tote and a cardboard box marked with a veterinary supply logo. She looked about 26, slim and slightly hunched from the weight she carried, with long auburn hair pulled into a loose ponytail that frayed around her face in soft strands. Her skin was pale, dusted with freckles across her nose and cheeks, and her eyes, hazel, quick and alert, kept flicking between the box and the uneven pavement ahead. She wore a green parka that looked one size too big, dark leggings, and worn sneakers, the practical uniform of someone who spent long hours on their feet rather than in front of a mirror. There was a gentleness to her movements, even in her hurry, and an underlying tension, as if she was used to being careful. Her name, Mike would soon learn, was Sarah Miller, and she worked as a veterinary technician at a small clinic a few blocks inland. At that moment, She was only trying to get home before the temperature dropped further, unaware she had already drawn the attention of the wrong person. Brandon Hale spotted her the moment he stepped onto the path. He was 29, clean-cut in a way that spoke of money rather than discipline, with slicked-back dark hair and a face that hadn't known real hardship. He wore a tailored coat that probably cost more than Mike's monthly rent and shoes that had never seen factory floors or oil-stained concrete. Brandon moved with exaggerated confidence, his shoulders loose, his grin practiced and careless. Two men trailed behind him at a distance, broad and silent, their eyes scanning not for danger but witnesses. Brandon was used to the world stepping aside for him. His father owned contracts at the port, had fingers in unions and shipping companies, and carried a name that opened doors or closed mouths. "Well, damn," Brandon said loudly as he fell into step beside Sarah, his voice slicing through the muted park sounds. "You look like you could use a hand. That box looks heavy." Sarah stiffened but kept walking, her grip tightening on the tote. "I'm fine," she replied, polite but firm, eyes forward. Brandon chuckled, drifting closer. "Come on, don't be like that. A pretty girl shouldn't be hauling stuff alone." She stopped then, turning just enough to face him. "I said no," she said, her voice steady despite the tension in her shoulders. "Please move." Something ugly flickered behind Brandon's smile. Rejection was not something he handled well. His gaze dropped, then shifted, and landed on Rex. "That dog of yours?" he sneered, though Rex wasn't Sarah's. "Looks mean." Rex sensed the change instantly, stepping forward just half a pace, his body angling between Brandon and Sarah, a low, warning rumble barely audible in his chest. Brandon's face twisted. "Get this mutt away from me!" Before Sarah could react, Brandon lifted his foot and kicked. The blow landed hard against Rex's side. The sound, a sharp, pained yelp, cut through the park. Rex stumbled but didn't fall, his breath hitching as pain rippled through him. Sarah dropped the box, hands flying to her mouth. "Oh, my God!" she cried, dropping to her knees beside the dog. Rex wheezed, then forced himself upright, planting his paws between her and Brandon despite the pain. That was when Mike moved. Not fast, not with a shout, but with deliberate calm. He stepped forward, placing himself between Brandon and the injured dog, one hand resting lightly on Rex's shoulder. "That was enough," Mike said quietly. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried weight. Brandon laughed, the sound sharp and brittle. "You want a problem, old man?" he snapped, reaching inside his coat. The gun came out quickly, a black shape in his hand, shaking just enough to betray his adrenaline. Sarah froze. Rex growled, deeper now. Mike didn't lunge. He didn't reach for the weapon. He simply shifted his stance, feet grounding into the cracked pavement, his body forming a barrier. "Put it away," Mike said. His eyes never left Brandon's. There was no challenge in his voice, only certainty. For a moment Brandon hesitated. He wasn't used to that look, the look of someone who wasn't impressed, wasn't afraid, and wasn't trying to win. Sirens sounded in the distance, growing closer. Brandon cursed under his breath and shoved the gun back into his coat just as a patrol car rolled to a stop at the park entrance. The officers listened, nodded, glanced at Brandon's coat, his name. Their posture softened toward him, hardened toward Mike. Words like misunderstanding and everyone calm down floated through the air. Brandon smirked as they spoke, already dialing his father's number. Mike said nothing. He knelt beside Rex instead, checking his breathing, his hand steady despite the tightness in his chest. When the officers finally waved Brandon away and told Mike to move along, Mike stood slowly, helping Sarah to her feet. Rex leaned into him, still trembling, but standing. Mike met Sarah's gaze. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded, tears shining but unshed. "Thank you," she whispered. As Mike and Rex walked away, the weight of the afternoon settled heavy in his chest. He had no power, no money, no protection, but he had chosen to stand anyway. The veterinary clinic smelled of antiseptic, warm fur, and old wood, a quiet refuge tucked between aging brick buildings far from the noise of the docks. The lights inside were soft and yellow, humming faintly above as Sarah Miller guided Rex through the front door with careful hands, her movements controlled despite the tremor in her fingers. Up close, she looked even younger than she had in the park, slender and slightly underweight, with narrow shoulders that suggested long hours of lifting animals heavier than herself. Her auburn hair had slipped free of its tie, falling in loose waves around her pale face, and her freckles stood out now that the cold had flushed her skin pink. There was exhaustion in her eyes, but also a steadiness that came from responsibility. She was the kind of woman who learned early how to keep going even when fear pressed close. Mike followed her inside, Rex leaning heavily into his leg with each step. The dog's breathing was shallow but steady, his dark eyes clouded with pain, yet still tracking Mike's every movement. Rex trusted him completely, and that trust sat heavy on Mike's chest. He had carried wounded men before, had watched stronger bodies fail under less force than that kick, and the helplessness crept back into his bones as Sarah lifted Rex onto the stainless steel exam table. "Okay, big guy," she murmured, her voice low and soothing as she ran practiced hands along Rex's ribs. "Let's see what we're dealing with." Her touch was gentle but confident, fingers pressing just enough to test reactions. Rex flinched and let out a soft whine, then stilled when Mike placed a hand between his ears. Sarah glanced up at Mike briefly, gratitude flickering across her face before she focused again. "You can stay right there. He feels safer with you close." Mike nodded, swallowing past the tightness in his throat. He watched her work, noting the efficiency of her movements, the way she spoke to Rex as if he were a person who needed reassurance rather than an animal that needed restraint. Sarah had chosen this job, he realized, because she understood vulnerability. After a few tense minutes, she straightened. "No broken ribs," she said quietly. "Heavy bruising, though. He's going to be sore for a while." She reached for a syringe, explaining each step even though Mike hadn't asked. "Pain meds, anti-inflammatory. He'll recover." Relief washed through Mike in a slow, almost painful wave. He exhaled, realizing he had been holding his breath. "Thank you," he said. The words felt inadequate. When Sarah rang up the bill, Mike reached into his pocket and unfolded a wad of crumpled bills and coins, counted carefully on the counter. It was grocery money, rent money, the last of what he'd saved for the month. Sarah noticed, but said nothing, only slid the receipt toward him with a small nod, her mouth tightening slightly. While Rex rested, Sarah brewed weak coffee in the back and handed Mike a chipped mug. They sat at opposite ends of the narrow exam room, the silence stretching comfortably between them. It was Sarah who broke it. "That man, Brandon Hale," she said, keeping her voice low as if the walls might be listening. "His family owns half the contracts at the port. People like him don't forget being embarrassed." She looked at Mike, really looked at him this time, taking in his worn jacket, the stiffness in his posture. "You didn't have to step in back there." Mike stared into the coffee, watching the surface tremble slightly with his hands. "Yeah," he said after a moment. "I did." He didn't explain further. He didn't talk about the things he had seen, the lines he had learned not to cross, and the ones he could never ignore. Some lessons lived too deep for words. As evening settled, the clinic grew quieter. The front door rattled slightly in the wind, the lock loose in its frame. Mike noticed immediately. "That hinge is barely holding," he said, rising stiffly. He crossed the room, tested it once more, then glanced at Sarah. "You got a toolbox?" She did, tucked in a small closet, unused more often than not. Mike worked methodically, tightening screws, realigning the latch, his hands steady despite the ache creeping back into his shoulders. Sarah watched from behind the counter, surprised by how natural the motion seemed for him, how he didn't rush, didn't complain. It was labor, yes, but it was also care. When he finished, the door closed with a solid, reassuring click. "Thank you," Sarah said softly. "Most people don't bother." Mike shrugged. "Doors should close right," he replied. "Same as people." Night fell fully by the time Sarah locked the front door. She hesitated, then looked at Mike. "You don't have to go back out there tonight," she said. "If you want, you can stay. Just for the night." It wasn't pity in her voice, but concern. Mike considered it. His room above the laundromat was drafty and loud, and tonight he doubted he'd sleep anyway. He nodded once. "I'll stay," he said. They laid a blanket on the floor near the door, and Rex eased himself down with a low grunt, positioning his body so he faced the entrance. His ears twitched at every sound, but he did not whine again. Mike sat against the wall nearby, boots still on, his jacket folded under his head. He wasn't preparing for a fight. There were no weapons, no traps, just presence, just watching. At some point, Sarah turned off the overhead lights, leaving only a lamp glowing in the corner. She paused, looking at Mike and Rex together, a man and a dog bearing matching weariness. "Good night," she said quietly. "Night," Mike replied. Sleep came in fragments. A distant siren, footsteps passing outside, Rex's ears lifting, then settling. Mike's eyes opened and closed, his body never fully relaxing. But in that shared quiet, something shifted. The fear was still there, the knowledge of trouble looming just beyond the door, but it no longer felt paralyzing. Healing, Mike realized, didn't always announce itself. Sometimes it looked like a repaired hinge, a dog breathing steadily through pain, and two strangers choosing not to be alone. The clinic settled into a fragile stillness after midnight, the kind that felt thin and watchful rather than peaceful, as if the building itself were listening. Outside, the wind scraped along the brick walls and carried distant harbor sounds, metal clanks, a low foghorn, a truck downshifting somewhere far away. Inside, the lights were off, except for the single lamp Sarah had left on near the reception desk, its glow muted by dusty shades. Mike sat on the floor with his back against the wall, knees bent, boots still on, his jacket folded beneath his shoulders. Sleep came in shallow waves, interrupted by old habits that refused to loosen their grip. He wasn't waiting for trouble. He was simply not pretending it couldn't come. Rex lay a few feet from the front door on the blanket Sarah had spread out earlier. Even injured, the German Shepherd chose position over comfort. His large body was angled so that one ear faced the door and the other the hallway, amber eyes half-lidded but never fully closed. His breathing was slow and controlled, the rhythm uneven when he shifted, and a dull ache caught him, yet he made no sound. He had learned silence long before Mike found him, back when noise invited pain. Now silence meant vigilance. Sarah was in the small treatment room behind the counter, seated on a rolling stool with a blanket draped around her shoulders. In the low light, she looked smaller than she had earlier, her tall, slender frame curved inward from exhaustion rather than fear. Her auburn hair hung loose down her back, catching the lamplight in copper threads, and her pale skin had lost its earlier flush, leaving her freckles soft and muted. She held a clipboard she wasn't really reading, her fingers resting lightly against the paper as if anchoring herself. Sarah had learned to stay composed in crises, bitten hands, panicked owners, animals slipping away despite her best efforts. But this was different. This was personal, and she could feel the weight of it pressing against her ribs. The sound came just after 1 a.m, not a crash, not a shout, just a soft metallic click near the front door, followed by the faint scrape of something testing the lock. Rex's head lifted instantly. His ears snapped forward, and a low vibration rolled through his chest, not a growl meant to intimidate, but a warning meant for Mike alone. Mike was on his feet in a breath, moving without sound, one hand raised slightly toward Rex in a calming gesture. Rex stayed down but tense, muscles bunched beneath his thick coat, eyes fixed on the door. The sound came again, slower this time, deliberate. Someone was learning the building, mapping it through touch and patience. Mike felt a familiar cold clarity settle over him, the one that had carried him through worse nights than this. He crossed the room quietly, reaching the lamp first and switching it off. Darkness swallowed the space, leaving only the faint glow of streetlight seeping through the frosted windows. He moved to Sarah, placing a finger to his lips, then gently guiding her toward the treatment room. "Stay here," he whispered, his voice steady, almost casual. "Lock it. Don't open it for anyone but me." Sarah nodded, swallowing hard, and did exactly as he said. Mike crouched behind the reception desk and pulled his phone from his pocket. His thumb hovered for a fraction of a second before he dialed emergency services. When the dispatcher answered, Mike spoke quietly, clearly, giving the address, explaining that someone was attempting to break in. He didn't embellish. He didn't speculate. He simply stated facts and stayed on the line as instructed. Outside, the testing stopped. Silence stretched, thick and heavy. Rex shifted, a small whine escaping before he could stop it, pain flickering through his ribs. He stayed where he was. Mike watched the door, counting breaths, listening to the building. A shadow passed the frosted glass, then another. There was a murmur of voices, low and indistinct, close enough to feel but not hear clearly. Whoever they weren't rushing. This wasn't a robbery. It was a message. Minutes later, footsteps retreated. An engine turned over somewhere down the block, idled, then faded into the distance. The silence returned, but it felt altered, like ground that had shifted just enough to make footing uncertain. Mike stayed where he was, until the dispatcher confirmed that a patrol car was nearby. When the officers arrived, their flashlights swept the exterior, finding no broken windows, no forced entry, nothing to write down beyond a vague report. They knocked, identified themselves, and Mike opened the door just enough to speak to them. The interaction was brief and unsatisfying, and when they left, the night pressed back in, unchanged. Mike closed the door and leaned his forehead against it for a moment, eyes closed. Rex rose carefully and moved closer, pressing his broad head against Mike's thigh, grounding him. Mike crouched, resting a hand on the dog's neck, feeling the warmth and the steady pulse beneath the fur. "Good boy," he murmured, the words rough in his throat. Rex's tail thumped once against the floor, restrained but sincere. Sarah emerged slowly from the treatment room, her steps cautious. "They're gone?" she asked. Mike nodded. "For now." She exhaled, her shoulders sagging as the tension drained. She looked at Rex, then at Mike. "He stayed," she said quietly, "even when he was hurting." Mike followed her gaze. "He always does," he replied. The words surprised him with their weight. They didn't go back to sleep. Instead, they sat in the dimness, talking softly about ordinary things. Sarah's childhood in a small town inland, Mike's welding job, Rex's favorite food. The conversation wasn't meant to distract so much as remind them that the world still contained normal edges. Yet beneath it all, Mike felt the shape of a decision forming. He understood something now with painful clarity. If he walked away, if he returned to his narrow room and his quiet routine, the warning would not end. It would simply find a softer target. As the sky began to lighten just before dawn, Mike stood by the window, watching the street. He took out his phone again, scrolling through old contacts until he found a name he hadn't called in years. Daniel Brooks. The man had been taller than Mike, broader through the shoulders, with a perpetually serious expression softened by tired eyes. Daniel had left the service earlier, trading uniform for suit, driven by the same frustration Mike felt now, watching the wrong people slip through the cracks. Mike didn't know if Daniel would answer. He only knew he had to try. He didn't dial yet. Instead, he looked back at Sarah, who was kneeling beside Rex, checking his bandage with careful hands. Rex leaned into her touch, trust slowly extending beyond Mike alone. In that moment, Mike understood the cost of staying and the cost of leaving. One was familiar, the other was necessary. When he finally pressed the call button, the sun was just cresting the buildings, and the clinic, battered but standing, felt like something worth protecting. Morning came gray and thin, the kind of light that revealed everything without warming it, and Mike Carter moved through the Port District as if he were part of its machinery, present, necessary, and largely ignored. He wore the same work jacket from the shipyard, shoulders dusted with metal flecks, his posture slightly stiff from another night without real sleep. At 47, he knew how to disappear in plain sight. Years of labor had given him a face people looked past, angular, weathered, with a short beard peppered with gray and eyes that stayed low unless there was a reason not to. He wasn't here to confront anyone. He was here to listen. The docks were waking up. Diesel engines coughed to life. Forklifts beeped warnings, and men in heavy jackets moved between containers with thermoses and clipboards. Mike paused near a coffee stand where dock workers gathered before shifts, buying a cup he didn't want just to stand close enough to hear the rhythm of their complaints. He caught fragments, late-night container movements, paperwork that didn't match the seals, shipments labeled frozen equipment that never seemed to need refrigeration. No one spoke in full sentences. No one wanted to be the first to say too much. Mike understood that silence. It was born from fear and reinforced by habit. He took mental notes, writing nothing down. Over the next 2 days, he noticed patterns. Certain trucks came and went only after midnight. Certain manifests were reprinted, dates altered by hand. He didn't trespass, didn't sneak into offices. He watched from public walkways, asked neutral questions, listened more than he spoke. His welding job gave him cover. No one questioned a man like him lingering near steel and sparks. Each small detail felt insignificant on its own, but together they formed a shape Mike recognized, the shape of something wrong. In the evenings, he returned to the clinic. Sarah Miller moved through those days with a quiet resilience that both worried and steadied him. She was tall and slim, her frame all long lines and careful balance, with auburn hair now braided loosely to keep it out of the way. The bruises on her wrists from restraining frightened animals were old and familiar. The tension in her jaw was new. She tried to keep her routine unchanged: appointments, feeding schedules, cleaning. But Mike could see the way her eyes lingered on the door each time it opened. She didn't ask him to stay. She didn't ask him to leave. She simply accepted his presence, and that trust weighed on him more than any threat. Rex healed slowly. The German Shepherd moved stiffly, favoring his side, but his spirit hadn't dulled. His coat still shone under the clinic lights, black along his back and golden at the chest, and his ears remained alert, swiveling toward every unfamiliar sound. He followed Mike closely, but when Sarah knelt beside him to change bandages, he allowed her touch now, resting his head against her knee. Trust, Mike thought, was not given all at once. It was built. On the third night, Mike made the call. Daniel Brooks answered on the second ring. Even through the phone, Mike could hear the fatigue in his voice, the controlled patience of a man who had learned to carry responsibility without ceremony. Daniel was in his early 50s now, broad-shouldered, with a receding hairline and a habit of rubbing the bridge of his nose when thinking. He had left the service because he was tired of watching good men break themselves against systems that protected the wrong people. "Tell me what you have," Daniel said, after Mike explained just enough. Mike did, slowly, carefully, sticking to what he knew he could stand behind. Daniel listened without interruption. When Mike finished, there was a pause. "You're right," Daniel said finally. "It sounds like wildlife trafficking. That's federal. But suspicion isn't enough. We need time to build it clean." Mike closed his eyes briefly. Time was the one thing they didn't have. Brandon Hale felt the pressure long before the evidence became real. He was a man ruled by impulse, his confidence brittle beneath the surface. In his late 20s, Brandon still carried the sharp features of youth, smooth skin, hard eyes, but his temper had already begun to carve its mark into him. He had grown up believing consequences were for other people, and the quiet scrutiny now surrounding the docks made him restless. He noticed Mike's presence. He noticed the way conversation stopped when he walked by, and he decided to end the problem the only way he knew how. Sarah left the clinic just after dusk to pick up supplies, a short walk she had made hundreds of times. Rex, still healing, stayed behind with Mike. The call came 20 minutes later from an unknown number. Mike answered, and before a word was spoken, he heard Sarah's breathing, fast, uneven. Then a voice he recognized instantly, smug and thin. Brandon didn't threaten at first. He didn't need to. He only said, "You should have minded your business." Mike didn't shout. He didn't argue. He listened, storing every sound, every pause. When the call ended, he moved with a speed born not of anger, but clarity. He ran the route Sarah would have taken, heart pounding not with rage, but with dread. He found her car 3 blocks away, door open, groceries spilled across the pavement, and a few feet from it, in the shallow grass, lay Rex. The dog was conscious, but barely. Blood matted the fur behind his ear, his breathing shallow and rapid. Mike dropped to his knees, hands gentle despite their urgency. "Hey," he whispered, pressing a clean cloth against the wound. Rex's eyes fluttered, focusing on Mike with effort, and his tail twitched once before going still. Mike lifted him carefully, cradling the heavy body against his chest. The weight felt different now. not just physical, but moral. Back at the clinic, Mike worked silently, following Sarah's instructions he had watched 100 times. Clean the wound, apply pressure, keep him warm. His hands shook only once, briefly, before steadying. As Rex drifted into medicated sleep, Mike sat beside him on the floor, back against the kennel, and pressed his forehead to the wire door. "You did everything you could," he murmured. "You hear me? Everything." The anger came then, slow and cold, but he didn't let it take him. He thought of Daniel's words, of Sarah's trust, of Rex choosing the door over comfort. Hope, Mike understood, wasn't the absence of fury. It was the decision not to let fury decide. He wiped his face, stood, and picked up his phone again. This time, he didn't hesitate. Dawn arrived without ceremony, a pale wash of light slipping between warehouses and over the cracked asphalt of the old freight district, and Mike Carter stood with his hands in his jacket pockets, waiting. He had given Daniel Brooks everything he knew, times, routes, patterns, and then he had stepped back. That was the hardest part. Mike was built to move, to act, to place himself between danger and the vulnerable. But this time, he chose to trust a system he had long doubted. At 47, his face looked older in the morning light, the lines around his eyes deeper, the gray in his beard more pronounced. He felt the familiar ache in his back and the dull throb in his shoulder, reminders of years spent lifting steel and carrying memories he never talked about. He breathed through it and stayed where he was, because rushing in would not save Sarah. It would only make things worse. The warehouse sat quiet at the end of a narrow access road, its brick walls stained dark by decades of soot and rain. Mike had shown Daniel where to look and then retreated to a position far enough away to stay unseen, close enough to hear engines when they arrived. When the unmarked vehicles finally rolled in, he felt a strange mix of relief and fear twist in his chest. Daniel stepped out first, his tall frame stiff inside a dark jacket, his hair thinner than Mike remembered, and his posture carrying the weight of a man who had learned patience the hard way. Daniel didn't wave. He didn't acknowledge Mike at all. That was intentional. This was no longer Mike's moment to be seen. Inside the warehouse, Sarah Miller sat on a cold metal chair, her wrists bound but her spine straight. Even frightened, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that came from years of tending to injured animals without flinching. Her auburn hair was messy now, strands clinging to her pale, clammy skin, freckles standing out starkly beneath tired eyes that refused to look away. She had stopped crying hours ago. Fear had settled into something steadier, something she could endure. When footsteps echoed outside, her heart jumped, but she forced herself to breathe slowly, thinking of Rex's steady presence, of Mike's calm voice telling her to lock the door and stay put. She held on to those memories like a rope. Brandon Hale was pacing nearby, his energy sharp and erratic. In the harsh warehouse lights, his youth looked brittle rather than confident. His tailored clothes were rumpled, his slicked back hair undone by nervous hands. He snapped at the men with him, his voice high and impatient, unable to tolerate waiting. Brandon had always relied on momentum and intimidation. Stillness unnerved him. He didn't hear the approach of law enforcement until it was too late. The sudden flood of voices, commands cutting through the air, shattered his composure. He froze, then bolted, only to be stopped within seconds. The sound of handcuffs closing echoed through the space like punctuation. Sarah flinched at the noise, then looked up as an agent moved quickly to her side, cutting the restraints with practiced care. "You're safe," the woman said, her voice firm and professional. Sarah nodded, her legs weak as she stood, relief crashing into her so hard she had to grip the edge of the table to stay upright. When she was led outside, the cool morning air hit her face, and she closed her eyes, breathing it in. She didn't see Mike right away. That was deliberate, too. Rex woke slowly in the clinic kennel as the sun climbed higher, his head heavy, his body sore but alive. The bandage behind his ear had been changed, the bleeding controlled. He shifted, testing his weight, and let out a low huff of discomfort. When the door opened and Mike stepped in, Rex's tail thumped weakly against the floor. Mike knelt beside him, pressing his forehead briefly against the metal bars, eyes closed. "We're getting there," he murmured. "Just rest." Rex's eyes followed him as Mike stood, the bond between them unspoken and unbroken. By midday, the news had spread. The Hale family name, once spoken carefully around the docks, was suddenly heavy with accusation. Charges came down: wildlife trafficking, coercion, conspiracy, and with them a quiet unraveling of fear. There were no cheers, no headlines bearing Mike's name. Daniel made sure of that. Mike didn't ask for recognition. He didn't want it. What he wanted was simpler and, in its own way, harder to obtain. The days that followed were slow, almost gentle. Rex healed steadily, each step a little firmer than the last. Sarah returned to the clinic, her hands shaking only once before settling into familiar motions. The community noticed. A carpenter from 2 blocks over fixed a broken window without being asked. A local bakery left boxes of day-old bread for the staff. Someone painted over old graffiti on the clinic's exterior. No one called it gratitude. They just showed up. Mike was offered his welding job back with steadier hours. It wasn't a promotion, wasn't a miracle, but it was enough. Enough to pay rent without counting coins, enough to breathe. He took it without comment. In the evenings, he helped Sarah close the clinic, fixing small things that had been broken for years. They didn't talk much about what had happened. They didn't need to. Healing, Mike had learned, was often quiet. Weeks later, Mike walked Rex through the park near the docks again. Rex moved more slowly now, favoring his healed side, but his head was high, ears alert, eyes bright. The wind still smelled of salt and rust, but it no longer felt suffocating. Across the street, Sarah stood in the clinic doorway, watching them approach. Her hair was pulled back neatly, her posture relaxed for the first time Mike could remember. She smiled when she saw them, a small, genuine expression that reached her eyes. Mike stopped at the edge of the park, Rex sitting at his side. He looked around at the ordinary world, the benches, the trees, the people passing without noticing, and felt something unfamiliar settle into his chest. It wasn't triumph. It was belonging. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He had a place to return to, a rhythm that made sense. Rex nudged his leg, impatient. Mike smiled faintly and started forward. The future wasn't grand. It didn't promise ease. But it was honest, and it was theirs. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the pavement, Mike understood something he had spent years avoiding. Justice might move slowly, but kindness endured. And sometimes that was enough to build a life. Sometimes we wait for miracles to arrive with thunder and light, but most of the time miracles come quietly. They come as a man who chooses to stand still instead of striking back. They come as a wounded dog who refuses to leave the door. They come as courage that whispers, "Do the right thing, even if no one sees." In a broken world, God does not always remove the darkness. Often He places a light inside ordinary people, and asks them to carry it. Mike was not rich. He was not powerful. He was not protected by status or influence. Yet when the moment came, he chose love over fear, patience over rage, and faith over revenge. And through that choice, lives were saved, wounds were healed, and justice found its way, slowly, imperfectly, but surely. If you are watching this and you feel tired, if you feel unseen, overlooked, or worn down by life, remember this: God sees the quiet good you do. He sees the doors you hold, the hearts you protect, the pain you carry in silence. And nothing done in love is ever wasted. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. We read every one. And if you believe in stories of courage, healing, and faith, please subscribe so you never miss another. Let us end with a prayer. May God place a hedge of protection around you and your loved ones. May He strengthen your hands when they are tired and steady your heart when fear tries to take hold. May He remind you that even in the darkest nights you are never alone. And may His quiet miracles find you right where you are. If you receive this prayer and believe, write Amen in the comments. God bless you, and stay safe until next time.